You walk today, maybe 30 minutes on the treadmill before breakfast, maybe an hour through the neighborhood after dinner, maybe the 10,000 step target your watch tracks and your physician endorsed. The calf muscles contracted with every step, each push-off compressing the deep veins and lymphatic vessels of the lower leg through one-way valves, returning blood and lymph to the trunk against gravity. The pump mechanics are established physics. Each step is a pump cycle. The circulatory system in your legs was maintained. Walking did what walking does. The veins compressed, the valves opened. The fluid that had pooled in your calves during the overnight hours was lifted toward the heart. If you wore compression socks, the socks helped. If you walked briskly, the pump worked harder. The system is robust. It responds to walking because walking demands the one thing this system needs: forceful calf contraction against body weight. Your legs contain 4 other systems. None of them received what they need from that walk. They did not receive it from yesterday's walk or from any walk you have taken in the last decade. Not because you walked wrong or walked too little, but because walking is too efficient to load them. The gait cycle that feels effortless is effortless because the muscles are doing less work than you assume. The gravitational pendulum that makes human walking the most energy-efficient bipedal locomotion in nature is recovering 65% of each step's mechanical energy, passively recycling potential energy into kinetic energy and back again without muscular contribution. The muscles steer the arc. The pendulum drives the locomotion. And the 4 systems that need muscular loading to maintain their architecture are the 4 systems the pendulum's efficiency leaves behind. 5 systems in 2 legs, 1 reached, 4 declining in silence. The physics of why walking cannot reach them is inside the gait cycle itself, inside the mechanism that makes walking feel effortless, inside the engineering that allowed your ancestors to cover distances no other primate could match. The efficiency that saved their lives is costing you 4 systems you did not know you had. And the word that matters is efficiency. Not laziness or insufficient effort. Efficiency, not laziness. The more efficiently you walk, the less your muscles work. The less your muscles work, the fewer systems receive loading. One system walking reaches is the calf pump, and understanding why it is the exception reveals the rule. Gastrocnemius and soleus contract during push-off, generating plantar flexion force against the full body weight. 70, 80, 90 kilograms pressing through the forefoot as the ankle extends and the body vaults forward over the stance foot. This is forceful, demanding muscular work, the kind of loading that triggers mechanotransduction, that maintains muscle mass, that crosses the threshold between activation and training. Why is push-off the exception? Because push-off is the one moment in the gait cycle where the gravitational pendulum that makes walking efficient cannot substitute for muscular effort. The body must generate the upward force that launches each new pendulum arc. No passive mechanism can replace this. The calves do real work because the physics of the gait cycle demands irreducible muscular effort at this specific phase. There is no gravitational shortcut for launching the body upward and forward into the next pendulum arc. Every other phase, swing, stance, deceleration, has a gravitational substitute. The pendulum does the work and the muscles provide only guidance. What matters is why the calf pump is the only system walking loads adequately. The answer lives in the pendulum physics, and it reverses the intuition that walking is good for your legs. Clearance system is different. The tibialis anterior, the muscle running down the front of the shin, lifts the foot during the swing phase of every step, creating the margin between the toe and the ground that prevents tripping. During walking, the tibialis anterior activates at approximately 10 to 15% of maximum, enough to lift a 1 kilogram foot through 10 to 15 degrees of dorsiflexion above neutral. Not enough to maintain the muscle's force-generating capacity against the 1 to 2% annual sarcopenic decline operating on every insufficiently loaded muscle. Numbers deserve scrutiny because they reveal the paradox. 20,000 activations per day, twice per step, 10,000 steps. Every single activation at the walking intensity. The loading threshold for muscle maintenance, the intensity required to trigger the mechanotransduction signals that preserve cross-sectional area, sits at approximately 40 to 60% of maximum voluntary contraction. The gap between 10% and 40% is not a small shortfall. It is a binary divide. Below the threshold, the structural maintenance signal does not fire regardless of how many times the muscle activates. Above it, the signal fires regardless of how few repetitions occur. 10 repetitions at 70% provides more maintenance stimulus than a full day of walking level activations. The tibialis anterior is the most frequently activated and least adequately loaded muscle in the walking leg. Consequence is a specific measurement, 2 centimeters of minimum toe clearance during the swing phase. 2 centimeters maintained entirely by the tibialis anterior's dorsiflexion force. As the muscle atrophies, losing force at the sarcopenic rate despite the daily activation count, the clearance narrows by fractions of a millimeter per year, invisible for decades. The margin that was 3 centimeters at 40 becomes 2 at 55 and 1.5 at 65. The toe catches on a rug edge that has been the same height for 20 years. The surface did not change. The clearance closed. Now the metabolic engine, the soleus, the deep calf muscle beneath the gastrocnemius, a flat, broad muscle that runs from below the knee to the Achilles tendon, fires during push-off. Brief activation, a fraction of a second, then silence during the swing phase as the leg swings forward and the soleus relaxes. Hamilton and colleagues revealed the metabolic dimension in eye science. Sustained soleus contraction release cycling, performed as seated heel raises maintained continuously for minutes, produced a 52% reduction in blood glucose excursion and a 60% reduction in insulin response. From a muscle comprising approximately 1% of body weight, 1% of body mass producing metabolic effects that rival pharmaceutical intervention, but only when the activation is sustained. Metabolic pathways, oxidative phosphorylation fueled by blood glucose and circulating lipids, the aerobic energy system that runs on oxygen delivered through the bloodstream. The soleus is approximately 95% slow-twitch, oxidative fibers, the highest proportion of any muscle in the body, designed specifically for this pathway. Reaching steady-state throughput requires continuous mitochondrial activation maintained for minutes. The oxidative enzymes must cycle through their catalytic sequences repeatedly to reach full capacity. The electron transport chain must achieve operating temperature, the point where substrate delivery, enzyme cycling, and ATP production reach equilibrium, and the mitochondria run at maximum efficiency. Walking provides brief push-off bursts interrupted by swing phases. Each push-off activates the soleus for a fraction of a second. The mitochondrial enzymes begin ramping toward capacity. Then the swing phase arrives, the contraction ends, and the enzymes cycle back down before reaching it. Thousands of startup transients throughout the day but never operating temperature. The engine is present. The mitochondria are dense. The capillary supply is rich. The oxidative enzymes are manufactured and ready. The fuel delivery system is functional. Glucose and lipids circulate in the bloodstream continuously. The activation pattern walking provides does not match the temporal requirement of the oxidative pathway the soleus uses. Power angle is the fourth system. The gluteus maximus, the largest muscle in the human body, activates during walking at 15 to 25% of its maximum. Hip extension through a modest range, 10 to 20 degrees behind vertical. The muscle engages enough to extend the hip during the stance phase, not enough to maintain its force production at the angles where it generates peak output. Well, the gluteus maximus reaches peak force at deep hip flexion, angles below 90 degrees. The squat depth, the floor rising depth, the catching a stumble depth. Standing from a chair at 90 degrees uses primarily the quadriceps. Standing from the floor at 120 degrees demands the gluteus maximus through its full force length range. Walking never takes the hip below 0 degrees of flexion, never enters the angular territory where the largest muscle generates its greatest force. The angle that determines whether you can rise from a low toilet, recover from a stumble, stand from a car seat that sits 20 centimeters lower than a kitchen chair, or get up from the ground after bending to garden is the angle walking systematically avoids. Every step operates in the shallow zone where the gluteus maximus contributes minimally and the quadriceps dominate. The largest muscle in the body rides through the gait cycle as a passenger, contributing stability but never approaching the force production it is capable of at deeper angles. Mapping each system against the gait cycle, activation percentage, loading duration, joint angle range, I saw the pattern. Not 4 independent problems, one problem expressed 4 ways. The same root cause producing 4 different insufficiencies through 4 different mechanisms. The walking that maintained the calf pump could not reach the other 4 because the walking itself was designed to avoid loading them. And then, the preservation system, The fifth system, and the one most recently understood at the molecular level, each walking stride includes a brief deceleration phase, the moment the heel strikes the ground and the body decelerates before the next push-off. During this phase, the quadriceps lengthen under load. The muscle extends while producing force, an eccentric contraction, the opposite of the concentric shortening that occurs when the muscle lifts a weight. The Stair script established that eccentric contraction generates 1.3 to 1.8 times more force than concentric contraction, a fact that sounds like a measurement error until the molecular mechanism explains it. Measurement that matters for walking is time. The eccentric deceleration during each stride lasts approximately 100 to 200 milliseconds, the brief instant between heel contact and midstance when the body's forward momentum is absorbed and redirected upward into the pendulum arc. That millisecond window of eccentric loading, repeated with every stride, the mechanotransduction signal that triggers muscle adaptation through the eccentric-specific molecular pathway, requires sustained loading of 3 to 4 seconds, the duration needed for the molecular cascade inside the sarcomere to propagate through the protein that makes eccentric force possible. 1/50th. Walking provides 1/50th of the required duration. Compare a controlled 4-second descent from standing to seated, lowering the body weight slowly through the full range of knee flexion, provides 4 continuous seconds of eccentric quadriceps loading. One descent provides 20 times the eccentric stimulus duration of one walking stride. One single descent provides more total eccentric stimulus duration than 2,000 walking strides combined. The arithmetic is that stark. 5 deliberate descents throughout the day, sitting down 5 times slowly, 4 seconds each, under body weight, provides more total eccentric stimulus than an entire day of walking at any pace. The molecular spring that has been inside every sarcomere for the person's entire life has never been given time to stretch to its full domain cascade, not because the person was inactive, but because the activity they performed operated in millisecond pulses that the 300 domain unfolding sequence cannot utilize. The preservation system is not receiving insufficient loading from walking. It is receiving a qualitatively different input, millisecond pulses instead of second duration holds. The molecular mechanism, titin, the largest protein in the human body, a molecular spring spanning half the sarcomere, explains why the duration difference is not merely quantitative but categorical. Walking's millisecond deceleration allows a handful of titin's 300 immunoglobulin domains to unfold. A 4-second controlled descent allows the sequential cascade to propagate through the full molecule. The difference between partial and full unfolding is the difference between a maintenance signal that does not reach threshold and one that triggers satellite cell activation, myofibrillar protein synthesis, and the structural adaptation that preserves the muscle's force-generating capacity across decades. You know the 5 systems now, and the specific gap walking leaves in each one. Question shifts from what is missing to why walking cannot provide it. The 4 gaps share a root cause, not 4 independent problems, but one problem expressed through 4 different molecular barriers. Root cause is the inverted pendulum. The walking script described the mechanics. The center of mass vaults over the stance leg, with each step rising as it passes over the foot and falling as it moves ahead, exchanging potential and kinetic energy in a continuous gravitational cycle. Up to 65% of the mechanical energy from one step is recovered passively in the next, stored as gravitational potential energy at the top of the arc and released as kinetic energy on the descent. No muscle produces this energy exchange. Gravity does it. The same gravitational field that pulls objects to the floor stores energy in the body's rising center of mass and releases it as the body falls forward into the next step. The exchange is passive, automatic, and remarkably efficient. A child walking for the first time exploits it. An adult exploits it with every step of every walk. Walking's effortlessness is not an illusion. It is the pendulum. The pendulum is the reason walking feels easy, the reason you can walk for an hour without exhaustion, the reason an 80-year-old can walk a mile at a comfortable pace but cannot lower into a chair slowly over 4 seconds. And the reason walking feels easy is the reason 4 systems are declining. This efficiency is the physics that makes walking insufficient. The pendulum's energy recovery means the muscles contribute only 35% of the mechanical cost of locomotion. The gravitational pendulum performs the rest. The calculation is worth pausing on. For every joule of mechanical energy a walking step requires, the muscles produce only 0.35 joules. The pendulum supplies the remaining 0.65 from the gravitational potential energy stored during the previous step's arc. The muscles guide the pendulum. They do not power it. The body moves forward primarily on recycled gravitational energy, with the muscles contributing corrections, adjustments, and the push-off that initiates each new arc. This is why walking feels effortless compared to running, jumping, or climbing stairs. Running abandons the pendulum. Both feet leave the ground during the flight phase, breaking the gravitational energy exchange. The muscles must produce the energy the pendulum no longer recovers. Walking at 4 kilometers per hour costs approximately 3.5 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute above resting. Running at the same speed, a slow jog, costs approximately 10 milliliters. The threefold increase is the cost of abandoning the pendulum. Evolution optimized walking for distance, not for loading. The body that could walk furthest on the least muscular investment survived, out-traveled its competitors, reached water sources and hunting grounds that less efficient walkers could not. The body that loaded its muscles maximally during every step consumed more energy, covered less ground, and was outcompeted. Natural selection chose the pendulum. The pendulum chose underloading, and the 4 systems that need loading above what the pendulum permits have been declining in every walking human since the species optimized its gait for distance over force. The calf pump survived because push-off is the one phase the pendulum cannot replace. The body must push off the ground to vault over the stance leg, and there is no passive mechanism for generating this upward-forward force. Every other phase has a pendulum substitute. The swing phase uses gravitational acceleration. The deceleration phase converts kinetic energy to potential energy passively. Only push-off requires irreducible muscular effort, genuine force production against body weight that no gravitational exchange can replace. Well, knowing the pendulum is the root cause reveals why each barrier is molecular, not merely mechanical. The tibialis anterior barrier is a mechanotransduction threshold, and understanding what the threshold means at the cellular level explains why the daily activation count produces zero maintenance stimulus. At this activation level, the muscle fibers shorten minimally. The sarcomeres contract through a small fraction of their available range, producing the modest force required to lift a 1 kilogram foot. The deformation of the cell membrane, the sarcolemma, is correspondingly small. The mechanosensitive ion channels embedded in the sarcolemma are stretch-activated cation channels, protein structures that change conformation when the membrane is deformed beyond a specific threshold. Below that deformation threshold, the channels remain in their closed conformation. The membrane stretches slightly, the channel protein flexes, but the conformational change that opens the ion pore does not occur. No calcium enters the cell through these channels. No downstream signaling cascade initiates. Above the threshold, at 40 to 60% of maximum voluntary contraction and higher, the membrane deformation is sufficient. The channels open. Calcium floods the cytoplasm through the opened pores. The calcium signal activates calcineurin and other calcium-dependent signaling molecules. Satellite cells, the resident stem cells that sit dormant outside the muscle fiber membrane in a quiescent state, receive the calcium-dependent activation signal, exit dormancy, proliferate through several rounds of cell division, and fuse with the existing muscle fiber. Each fusion donates a new nucleus, a new transcriptional center capable of directing myofibrillar protein synthesis. More nuclei means more protein production capacity. More protein production means maintained or increased cross-sectional area. The entire cascade, from channel opening to satellite cell fusion to new nucleus to protein synthesis, requires the initial mechanosensitive channel to open. Below the deformation threshold, the cascade never begins. The muscle fires electrically. The maintenance pathway stays silent. At the walking activation level, none of this happens. No calcium signal, no satellite cell activation, no myofibrillar protein synthesis. The muscle is electrically active. The motor neurons fire. The acetylcholine crosses the neuromuscular junction. The muscle contracts, but the structural maintenance pathway never receives its trigger. The neural pathway stays open while the muscle mass erodes beneath it. At 70 to 80% of maximum voluntary contraction, the estimated innate activation during heel walking, the threshold is crossed. The channels open, the cascade fires, and the maintenance signal arrives. And then, the soleus barrier is temporal, not intensity-based. The soleus is 95% slow-twitch oxidative fibers, and its metabolic pathway requires continuous mitochondrial activation to reach steady-state throughput. The distinction between activation and sustained loading is the soleus barrier. A car engine started and stopped with every push-off would never warm up. The coolant would never reach operating temperature. The catalytic converter would never light off. The fuel efficiency at operating temperature, the mode where the engine burns cleanest and produces maximum power per unit of fuel, would never be achieved. The soleus mitochondria are that engine. The electron transport chain is the combustion chamber. Sustained contraction-release cycling. The seated heel raises Hamilton measured, brings the metabolic engine to operating temperature where glucose uptake and lipid oxidation reach their maximum efficiency. Walking's intermittent push-offs never bring the oxidative pathway to steady state. The mitochondrial enzymes cycle up and down without reaching the throughput Hamilton measured during sustained activation. Gluteus maximus barrier is geometric, a force-length relationship governed by sarcomere physics that no amount of walking can overcome. The actin and myosin filaments in each sarcomere overlap at a specific ratio that depends on the muscle's current length. At the muscle's optimal length, where the overlap produces the maximum number of cross-bridge attachment sites available for force generation, force production peaks. The relationship is parabolic, too short, and the filaments collide, reducing available attachment sites. Too long, and the filaments pull apart, reducing overlap. Peak force occurs at the optimal overlap, the Goldilocks zone of sarcomere length, where the maximum number of myosin heads can bind actin binding sites and generate cross-bridge cycling force. For the gluteus maximus, that optimal length occurs at deep hip flexion, below 90 degrees of hip angle, where the muscle is stretched to the sarcomere length that maximizes cross-bridge availability. Walking uses hip angles between approximately 10 degrees of flexion and 20 degrees of extension, the shallow end of the range. At these angles, the sarcomere overlap is beyond optimal. The filaments have slid past the peak overlap zone. Fewer cross-bridges can form and force production drops significantly compared to what the muscle can generate at deeper angles where the overlap is optimal. Decline self-reinforces across decades. As the gluteus maximus weakens from the absent deep angle stimulus, the body shifts more work to the quadriceps and the hip flexors. The quadriceps can handle shallow angle tasks, chair rising at 90 degrees, stair climbing, level walking, without the gluteus maximus at full capacity. The compensation is invisible. The person stands from chairs, climbs stairs, walks for miles, and never encounters the angle that would reveal the gluteus maximus has been declining. The substitution works until the day the deep angle is demanded without warning: a fall, a low surface, a recovery from a stumble, standing from the ground after bending to pick something up. The force that should have been there, the peak force the gluteus maximus is capable of generating at deep flexion angles, is absent. Decades of walking at shallow angles allowed the muscle to atrophy at the very length where its force production matters most. The compensation that worked for 20 years at chair height fails at floor height. The person who could always stand from a dining chair discovers they cannot rise from the garden without using their hands. The hands compensate for the gluteus maximus. The arms push where the hips should power. The substitution cascade extends until the day no substitution remains. Now, the preservation system's barrier is the most specific and the most recently understood. Inside every sarcomere sits titin, the largest protein in the human body, a single molecule spanning half the sarcomere length, from the Z-disc to the M-line. One molecule approximately 34,000 amino acids long. One molecule. Link described titin's mechanical properties in physiological reviews. During eccentric contraction, when the muscle lengthens under tension, titin stretches like a molecular spring. Its immunoglobulin-like domains, approximately 300 arranged in series along the molecule's length, unfold sequentially under tension. Each domain is a compact folded structure held together by hydrogen bonds and hydrophobic interactions. When the tension exceeds the unfolding threshold for a given domain, approximately 1 to 200 piconewtons, the bonds break, the domain unfolds, and the molecular chain extends by approximately 4 nanometers. The unfolding releases the stored elastic energy and simultaneously generates passive force that adds to the active cross-bridge force the actin-myosin interaction produces. This is the molecular explanation for why muscles generate 1.3 to 1.8 times more force during lengthening than during shortening. Two force generators operating simultaneously, the active cross-bridges cycling between actin and myosin, plus the passive titin domains unfolding under stretch. During concentric contraction, shortening, the titin molecule slackens and contributes no force, only the cross-bridges work. During eccentric contraction, lengthening, both generators fire. The eccentric force advantage is not a property of the cross-bridges themselves, it is titin. Domain unfolding requires time, sequential unfolding across 300 domains, each requiring tens of milliseconds to reach its unfolding threshold and extend, demands sustained tension maintained for seconds, 3 to 4 seconds of continuous eccentric loading for the cascade to propagate through the full molecule. Walking's deceleration phase provides only the millisecond window per stride. In that time, perhaps 10 to 20 of the 300 domains unfold, a small fraction of the molecular spring's total range. The passive elastic force generated by 20 domain unfoldings is a fraction of the force the full cascade produces. The mechanotransduction signal from partial unfolding may not reach the threshold required to activate satellite cells, the same binary threshold problem the tibialis anterior faces, expressed through a different molecular mechanism. The 4-second descent the arithmetic already established provides time for the sequential cascade to propagate through the full molecule. 300 domains unfolding in sequence, each unfolding event extending the molecular chain by 4 nanometers, generating passive elastic force, creating micro-disruptions in sarcomere architecture that the mechanosensitive signaling pathways register as a loading event. The satellite cells activate. The protein synthesis response begins. The muscle receives the structural maintenance signal that walking's millisecond deceleration cannot deliver, not because the force is insufficient, but because the time is insufficient for the molecular spring to complete its unfolding sequence. The descent provides the unfolding duration that walking's millisecond window cannot. Anyone with a joint replacement, active knee or hip inflammation, or a balance disorder affecting safe descent should consult their physician before deliberately deepening sit-to-stand angles or slowing descents under body weight. The eccentric and deep angle loading described above may exceed the capacity of joints still recovering from surgery or managing active inflammation. Walking is the most energy-efficient locomotion in nature. The pendulum recovers most of the mechanical energy from each step. The muscles contribute approximately 35% of the total mechanical cost, the irreducible fraction that guidance, corrections, push-off initiation, and postural stabilization demand. The walking you do is not wrong, it never was. The walking you do is not enough, and now you know why at the molecular level. The efficiency that saved the species is the physics that costs the individual. 4 molecular thresholds: mechanotransduction intensity, metabolic continuity, force angle geometry, and domain unfolding duration, each one placed beyond the reach of the most energy-efficient gait in evolutionary history by the pendulum mechanics that make that efficiency possible. Now you know which 4 and the molecular physics of why the most efficient gait on Earth cannot reach them.